Hi, I'm April McCabe. I am a town planner, a placemaker, and all round city nerd, an urban sociologist, you might say. And I'm about to read chapter 6 to you all. But where do you suppose Snugglepot and Mr. Lizard were all this time? When we last saw Snugglepot, he had gone to bed and he fell asleep wondering why Cuddle Pie was so long at the dentist. You remember? Well, he had hardly been asleep 2 ticks when he woke with a start. There was a loud knocking at the door. Snugglepot sprang out of bed shouting as he threw open the door. I'll catch you this time. To his great surprise, there stood Mr. Lizard. He seemed very upset and out of the breath. What's the matter? Cried Snugglepie. Oh, gum, gasped Mr. Lizard, sinking into a chair and fanning himself with the tip of his tail. Whatever is the matter? Repeated Snugglepot. It's Cuddle Pie, moaned Mr. Lizard. He's caught. Caught? Grasped Snugglepot. The Banksia men have got him, groaned Mr. Lizard. Oh, gum, 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 what shall we do? How? When? Who? Asked Snugglepot very excitedly. An old tramp came to my house and told me, he said. He saw the Banksia men hit Cuddle Pie on the head, put him into a bag, and run off down the road to Big Bad City, lickety-plick. Snugglepot was pulling on his travelling leaves. We must get off after him, quick sticks, he cried, reaching for his cap. Rag and scrag me, shouted Mr. Lizard, jumping up. Oh, silly scoot cinder that I am, why didn't I think of that? The plans, cried Snugglepot, rushing to the little hole he kept them in. Dr. Faustus Carp, seeing the Banksia men had only one leg, for he was the one whose leg had been bitten off when they were all rushed into the house of the giant octopus, took the Banksia men into his carriage and carried them to the hospital. For, he said, I can make you a new leg. And the little boy looked ill, so a few days in a shell will do him good. After that, the Banksia men had to do what he was told. So when he saw Anne taking Cuddle Pie away, he could only grind his teeth in rage. And he kicked so hard that his new leg came off and had to fix it all over again. You see what a wicked plot Mrs. Snake and the Banksia men had made. Now what had become of all the nuts who jumped into the sea? And where is little Winky Gerbera? All in good time, you should know. First, let's go with Snugglepot and Mr. Lizard and see what happens to them. Old Mr. Lizard galloped and galloped, sometimes stumbling into holes, sometimes jumping logs and scrambling over rocky places, and sometimes shying in the strange shadows cast by the moon. Snugglepot clung to his back with great difficulty, and all night they hastened on till at last they were, just as a pale light was stealing into the sky, Mr. Lizard could go no farther, and they stopped by a little waterhole to drink. An old tramp hobbled up to them as they were resting. Morning, mates, he said. Making a long journey to the big bad city, Snugglepot told him. I've just come from there, he said. Mr. Lizard asked him anxiously if he had passed anyone on the way. I seen rough-looking blokes, very rough-looking they was. One of them were dragging a little cove along and hitting him over the head with a stick. Hitting him cruel it was. Snugglepot and Mr. Lizard had heard enough. With a bound, Snugglepot was on Mr. Lizard's back, and Mr. Lizard was off up the road as if he were the wind. The old tramp burst out laughing and threw off the cloak that covered his head. As he gazed after them, he shook his fist and growled, Travel on, there's someone waiting for you in the big bad. But yet, it ain't your slimy Cuddle Pie. All the next day they pushed on, till at last they knew by the number of the houses they passed and the crowds of people that they were nearing Big Bad City. Once they were nearly run over by a motor car, and numbers of young nuts on scooters made them quite nervous. Then they saw a big crowd of nuts watching a football match. But on they went, poor Mr. Lizard's tongue hanging out and Snugglepie stiff with holding on. Still they went on. By and by they came to a big river. There were crowds of nuts and blossoms on the banks. Boats were racing and the crowds were cheering. It was most exciting. But on they went till the last they came right to the great city of Big Bad. All the time, as they went along, they kept asking people if they had seen a Banksia man with a little nut. No one had seen him. Mr. Lizard was so tired by this time that, spying an old shed, he hobbled into it, fell down, and fast asleep. Snugglepot arranged some grass under Mr. Lizard's head as a pillow and then stole out, for he was very hungry. Just a little way up the street, he came to a splendid tea shop. It was cheaper on the roof, so he went up. This is juicy, thought Snugglepot, as he sat at a small round table and ordered some grass root cakes and milk. Isn't it a nice blue day? He said to the plump Blossom who was sitting opposite. 'Tis a scented afternoon, agreed the Blossom. The cicadas are so trilly. Rippling, said Snugglepot. Did you see the regatta? Not quite, murmured the Blossom. Was it good? Treetop, said Snugglepot. And the football match? Just missed it, sighed the Blossom. Was it exciting? Simply bumpings, replied Snugglepot, sucking at his straw. My husband is an artist, said the Blossom with pride. Why, she explained, you are the nut who came to our house with Dr. Hodges Stickus, cried Snugglepot and the Blossom in one breath. The Blossom turned quite pink. Oh dear, she gasped. What a fright you've given me. I heard you were drowned in the sea. Only a little, said Snugglepot, and they laughed and chatted, and by the Blossom asked Snugglepot to come home with her to see her husband. But what about my friend Mr. Lizard? Bring him too, said the Blossom. Thank you, said Snugglepot, but when he looked into the shed, Mr. Lizard was gone. Where can he be? Exclaimed Snugglepot. So strange, said the Blossom, but my house is only just across the road. We'll send a servant to keep watch for him. So saying, she led the way home. The artist was delighted to see Snugglepot and begged him to camp there with him for a long time. So he did, and every day he went out looking for Cuddlepie and Mr. Lizard, but never could he see or hear anything of them, till at last he grew quite thin with anxiety. One day the artist asked Snugglepot to come into his studio to see a picture he had painted for the important exhibition soon to be open. There is a prize for the liveliest looking picture. I want to get it. As he said this, he threw open his studio door, and there, seated in a chair, comfortably looking back and smoking a pipe, was, who do you think? Why, old Mr. Lizard himself, as large as life. Snugglepot rushed in and was just about to embrace him when the artist caught him by the neck. What? He cried. You could spoil my picture, you rat, you bat, you native cat. And he shook Snugglepot till his eyes jumped. Oh, cried poor Snugglepot. I thought it was alive. It was my lost friend. And then out from behind a long green curtain stepped old Mr. Lizard. Snugglepot was overjoyed. There was great merriment at the artist's home that night. Dr. Hodges Stickus came around to dinner, and everyone declared the picture to be lifelike. Now it happened that another artist in Big Bad had decided to get the prize for the alivest picture. And most strange to say, he had chosen his model, a Banksia man. There was great excitement on the opening day. All the artists and other queer people went to see the pictures. When Snugglepot saw the portrait of the Banksia man, it looked so real that he felt quite nervous. A great eye seemed to blink at him. He stood rooted with horror. Then suddenly the picture burst open, and out from the frame sprung the Banksia man, almost on top of him. With a terrible yell, the Banksia man seized Snugglepot by the legs, and scattering the people right and left, he ran from the gallery. The artist rushed after him, shouting, Murder! Help! Stop him! But the Banksia man's long legs covered the ground so quickly that he turned so many different ways that no one could catch him, and soon the shouts died away in the distance. All this time, poor Snugglepot's head was going around and around, and he nearly fainted with the pain of being carried upside down. It's very cruel to carry any live thing upside down. Remember that. Suddenly, the Banksia man darted into a doorway and down a long passage, climbed a lot of steps, groped through a long, dark tunnel, and came out into a cave at the end. In the cave were a number of Banksia men smoking, arguing, and playing bones. When they saw Snugglepot, they all gathered around. Got him at last, said the Banksia man, panting. Is he alive? Grunted one, poking Snugglepot with his horrible bony finger. Is he what? Sneered the Banksia man, tossing Cuddlepot into a corner. What'll we do with him? That's the question. The little slimy sinner growled one. String and ring him, said the other. Rack and crack him, snarled another. Bust and rust him, croaked a monster with 3 eyes. Stick him on a bull ant's nest and they'll kill him, and the crows will come and pick his bones, squeaked the smallest, ugliest of them all. Oh, throw him to the bulldogs, shouted all the Banksia men, jumping about in wicked glee. Give him a dose first, muttered one of them. So they opened poor Snugglepot's mouth and poured some horrible juice into it, and that was the last thing Snugglepot remembered. Now, Mr. Lizard, being a very sporting fellow, had sneaked off to the races instead of going to the picture gallery with Snugglepot the artist. When he came home, his cap on one side and swinging his cane jauntily, he was amazed to find Mrs. Artist in tears and Mr. Artist saying the most dreadful words. No sooner had the terrible news gone into his ears than he dashed out of the door. Old Mr. Lizard was a sensible person, so he argued with himself as to which way the Banksia man would most likely have gone when he ran from the picture gallery. And sure enough, he guessed it well, for as he passed a doorway, he espied just inside upon the ground a little green cap. It was Snugglepot's. He knew it was the plan sticking inside. In less time than it takes to tell, old Mr. Lizard was standing outside the Banksia men's cave, breathing hard and listening. Well, come on, he heard one say. If we're going to cop that slimy lizard, we must be going. Mr. Lizard flattened himself against the wall. In his hands he held a heavy stick with a knobbly end. The first Banksia man came out of the dark passage. Whack went Mr. Lizard's stick, and down went the Banksia man. One, muttered Mr. Lizard under his breath, kicking the Banksia man to one side. Out came another Banksia man. Whack went Mr. Lizard's stick. Down went the Banksia man. Two, whispered Mr. Lizard. Out came another Banksia man. Thud went Mr. Lizard's stick. Down went the Banksia man. Out came another Banksia man. Flop went Mr. Lizard's stick, and down went the Banksia man. Out came 2 Banksia men together. Whack, whack went Mr. Lizard's stick. 6 murmured Mr. Lizard, swinging his stick. No more Banksia men came, not a sound in the cave. Mr. Lizard peeped in, not a soul there. Yes, just one poor little Snugglepot lying still and white, his hand and feet tied and his eyes closed. Mr. Lizard stooped down, he started back. Deady bones, he groaned. Alas, alas, why did I go to the races? Mr. Lizard flew into a passion of rage, weeping and saying dreadful words. He pulled all the Banksia men into a heap in the middle of the cave and set fire to them. Then lifting Snugglepot tenderly in his arms, he fled from the place, moaning and weeping as he went. And that really was the end of those wicked Banksia men.